Mark Reckless.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And it is a pleasure to follow the Right Honourable Member for Sutton Coldfield. I think the whole House and many out there in the country will appreciate the integrity of his work and the commitment he has given in this area. And as Secretary of State for International Development, I would like to say, although I don't put it as a particularly high hurdle, I think the record and reputation of British aid, particularly in reference to that of the European Union and that part of our spending that goes through there, is significantly higher. And the Right Honourable Member's reputation, I think, reflects his work in that area. I would, however, like to oppose this third reading and the principle of this bill. And I listen to the heckling coming from all round the House as I say that. Absolutely. And it continues. And I think honourable and right honourable members would do well to realise that the extent of the disconnect between what they want to do and what their constituents want to do is nowhere higher than in this area of overseas aid. The most recent poll I've seen from YouGov to the question of should we increase or decrease our overseas aid, 66% said decrease and only 7% said increase. However, in this House, the ratio of support seems to be even stronger in the other direction, of people who simply ignore their constituents and what they want to see happen in this area. There is a cosy cartel of establishment parties who ignore what their constituents want in this area and instead choose to... And again we hear the heckling once more of people who do not want to listen to the facts of how their constituents feel about what they purport to do in their name. I give way.
It's very difficult up on that high horse.
Before the honourable gentleman takes an intervention, the House must give the courtesy to the honourable gentleman that has been given to other members this morning. He might have something important to say. Mr. Reckless.
Is he not aware that there are very large numbers of people in this country that do feel passionately about inequality around the world, do feel passionately about the Ebola crisis and many other crises, and actually believe that there is a moral duty as well as a public good in raising money, donating money, both by the taxpayer and individually, to help alleviate this terrible suffering?
I'm aware there are a significant number of people in that category. And in particular, I would like to pay tribute to what many in that category do through their private charity of choosing to give their own money to charitable causes, whether here or overseas. But that is not what we're talking about here. We are talking, under threat of law, to take away money from our constituents and forcibly transfer that money overseas. And I say to the honourable member that, again, if you look at the reputable polling of what our constituents believe on this issue, two-thirds of them want to decrease overseas aid. Only 7% fall into that category, and the category of almost everyone in this chamber.
The honourable gentleman give way.
No, I'm finishing my point. Who want that to be cut. And that is simply ignored by, I said again, a cosy cartel of establishment parties that put aside what their constituents want and displace it with what they want instead, and vote it into law, and which I oppose. I give way.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Lee. Can I remind the honourable gentleman, I'm sure he's aware, that every month 30 million people actually support charities, and it's not an either-or. Many of those people wish to give money personally, but wish to see their country, their nation, actually supporting people who have nothing when we have so much. Would he not at least accept the fact that there is a spirit of decency, generosity and giving abroad in the land, even if it has not quite become apparent to him yet?
I do accept that spirit, and when people do that voluntarily out of their own resources, then that is something which I believe they deserve great credit for. What I object to is members of this House, through the force of law, forcing people to give their money overseas when only 7% of our electorate actually support that course of action. The other, I think, I give way to the Minister.
The last opinion poll that I saw, Madam Deputy Speaker, when asked what they thought we were giving in international development aid, they thought it was 15%. So perhaps they'll be dancing in the streets of Rochester when the honourable gentleman returns and tells them that we've cut it to 0.7.
I thank the honourable right honourable member for his intervention, and I think it reveals the extent of weight he puts on the views of our constituents. As all the members of this House, who in such large numbers vote to increase and put in law 0.7% of a rising amount of output, as if they are doing something on behalf of their constituents when they know that the vast majority of those constituents don't want them to do what they are doing. Equally as important, I'll give way before I move on to my next point.
Would you agree with me that his constituents, like mine, would not support the premise of this bill, which means that because spending as a percentage of GDP will go down across the government as a whole, this bill will mean that the government will spend more and more of a percentage of its income and spending on overseas aid. And my constituents certainly wouldn't want that, and I'm sure his wouldn't either.
Yes. Honourable member is quite correct, and is one of the very few members, right honourable members of this House, who appear actually to support and vote as their constituents would wish. And we have learnt today that the numbers are being revised up still further. We now see that we are going to be spending £12.4 billion on overseas aid. And my party, we want to reduce that. Not to eliminate it entirely, as perhaps the honourable member for Shipley might wish, but to cut it by 85%. That would give us a saving of £10.5 billion to spend on the priorities of our constituents. The other point that people just simply seem to ignore around this House is whether we as a country can afford this. If you want to give overseas aid, then you have to sell overseas more than you buy from overseas if you are going to do that on a sustainable basis. Yet we see now we have a current account deficit coming close to 5% of GDP. That is the usual sign, that 5%, of a country that is in crisis, of a position that is unsustainable. Yet what we are saying we will do, we will enshrine in law to give as an overseas transfer 0.7% of our GDP indefinitely through force of law. And we saw in the autumn statement the OBR and its three men and a dog approach to forecasting the current account deficit. They just blithely assume that 5% gap is going to disappear and become less than 2% over the forecast horizon. And partly they do that by assuming for some reason that overseas transfers are going to trend lower. There is no serious prospect of that happening while we are handing over 0.7% of our resources as overseas aid, let alone our contributions to the EU and the rising amount of remittances that we see transferred overseas following the degree of immigration we have seen in this country. I will give way.
He clearly doesn't see the point of giving aid from a humanitarian or generous or compassionate principle, but would he at least acknowledge that there's a self-interested principle as well? If we want a safer, more secure world, with less people being forced to leave their countries, which his party certainly doesn't like, then actually being able to share our wealth more equally would be a very good way of achieving that.
No, I don't acknowledge that. I think it's complete baloney, this idea that by giving all this overseas aid, we are reducing the amount of immigration to our country. What we see is that immigration, it tends to be much more from middle-income people. And the most sort of strife-torn, notorious people with that don't have the money to pay people smugglers to come illegally into our country. And I just don't think it's right, and I don't think the evidence supports this idea that overseas aid is somehow reducing immigration or is benefiting us from a selfish perspective of leading to more trade. Indeed, we completely detied aid from trade in a way that other countries, and perhaps most notably France, have done traditionally, of trying to bring some benefit to our constituents, to companies in our country, of saying, well, we will give you this aid, but it should be spent in this way that will benefit your countries, but will also benefit our constituents. And I think by untying aid in that way, we have made aid even less popular than it previously was. And this idea we can somehow sustain 0.7% giving away overseas aid every year when we are borrowing 5% of our output every year. And we have no plans to put that right. Even the OBR says our exports are going to be growing more slowly than our imports. It just has preposterous assumptions that suddenly we're going to get 2.5% extra of GDP from investment income and somehow transfers are going to decline. They're not. All this money we are giving from overseas aid, we are borrowing. And we are borrowing it from overseas. We are purporting to be a rich country that's able to give this great handout of 0.7%. 7% of everything we produce every year, but it's not actually what we produce that we're giving, it's money that we are borrowing, and borrowing from overseas, and debts we are building up for our children and our grandchildren. And we see the other forecast that debt as a proportion of household income in that sector is going to go up to 180% of GDP. And it's partly doing that in order to pay the taxes that this government needs in order to give away 0.7% of its output to overseas. So I say to people here that, one, think of what your our constituents want, and think also of whether it is sustainable to give away this amount of money when actually we're having to borrow it all from overseas. I give away.
The honourable gentleman has tried to paint a picture of some sort of cosy cartel, I think were the words he used, Madam Deputy Speaker, and of not listening to our constituents. Does he believe that we're not listening to our constituents when we have all listened to the voices of many churchgoers, of mosque-goers, of synagogue-goers in our constituencies, all of whom have written to us, and the voice of people like the Archbishop of Canterbury, the Catholic cardinals, the leaders of all the major faiths, many others who have all urged us to be here today to vote for this bill? Does he think we shouldn't be listening to their voices and they're part of some sort of cosy cartel?
I think honourable and right honourable members should listen to all our constituents. But the problem is we listen greatly to those who write to us and those who lobby us on these matters, and we ignore the fact that the vast majority of our constituents are opposed to what they want. And that is why I refer to the radical tradition, the tradition of Gladstonian finance, now being represented not in his party, but in my party. Because the vast majority of working class people in this country do not want to give vast amounts of their income to the government, including to be given away in overseas aid. I give away again.
The honourable gentleman should know that Gladstone said that the lives of the hill tribesmen in the wilds of Afghanistan were as inviolable in the eyes of Almighty God as are our own. He was a champion of humanitarian intervention in other parts of the world. He would have been proud of us turning up to save lives today, and the honourable gentleman should not quote him in defence of his mean-minded approach.
I could not disagree more. The difference between the Liberal Democrat Party today and the Liberal Party of Gladstone could not be greater. And what Gladstone would have welcomed, what Gladstone was extolled, was private charity. The last thing he would have wanted government to go in and tax people on the pain of fines, on the pain of going to prison if they don't pay the fines, unless they give their money and have that money used as a political class at the top of that country might discern in handing out money, 0.7% of everything we earn, overseas, and giving that money away when we're actually having to borrow 5% of our output from overseas in order to finance it. It is the complete antithesis of everything that Gladstone stood for, just as his party has become. The final point I want to make, and perhaps we may be able to even find a degree of consensus on this point, there is one good principle of this bill, and it is the only good principle of this bill, and that is it sets a precedent. And it sets a precedent for this House taking back control of government spending. It is something we abandoned in the 1930s. We gave away during that period of national government with overwhelming majority. Members, right honourable members of this House, gave up scrutinising effectively the spending of government. We now have instead 3 estimates days a year where we debate everything except the spending estimates. And then there are 1 or 2 votes a year that almost invariably go through NEMCOM, and there is no real scrutiny of spending. So the principle of saying what area every government or activity should have in terms of public spending and putting that into legislation, or at least into a process where this House can effectively hold ministers to account, is, I think, a good one, albeit not a sensible way to do it by specifying a minimum without a maximum.